But it's really great to be here, not only because it's a fantastic location, but also because it's great to work with Open Lab, and particularly as a Newcastle MP. Obviously, I'm proud of Newcastle University's involvement in Open Lab, and in fact, I have benefited from some of the work of the people involved in my office in Newcastle. But I'd also say that as Shadow Minister for Industrial Strategy, Science and Innovation, this is a key area and a key issue and a key debate, and I'll say a little bit about that and why that is. Now, I don't know how many of you know or follow this, but today should have been President Trump's State of the Nation address. It's not, because of the government shutdown. But what was interesting for me particularly is that over the last week, I have had occasion to comment on and retweet comments by one of his most vocal adversaries, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Most recently, when she said, on Twitter, when you don't address human bias, that bias gets automated. Machines are reflections of their creators, which means they are flawed, and we should be mindful of that. And this was in response to reports that Amazon's technology, facial recognition technology, being used in the by the public sector in the States and the US. Amazon's technology labeled darker-skinned women as men 31% of the time. Lighter-skinned women were misidentified 7% of the time. Darker-skinned men had a 1% error rate, while lighter-skinned men had none. Funny that, And I tweeted that. This was entirely predictable. We know that because we predicted it. I predicted it. Others predicted it. But government has done absolutely nothing about this or the other harms of technology plus monopoly power plus data exploitation. I also said that maths plus bias equals bias plus plus, but that was a tech joke, which I don't think anybody got anyway. Now, AOC, as she's known, doesn't need my support. She has 2.7 million Twitter followers. And she achieves what we politicians call cut-through on issues as diverse as climate change and progressive taxation. And now she has algorithms in her sights. AOC is a part of a diverse group of a platform of newly elected Democrats in the US, which are called Justice Democrats. They refuse corporate funding from big finance or big tech and seek to truly represent their constituencies. And that's why I've taken as the theme for this keynote, Justice Digital, because I think they represent a tide which is turning, and tech, and that is both the public and the private sector, needs to change with it before it's too late. And and I should declare an interest. I am a chartered engineer, and a chartered electrical engineer, to be clear. And before I was elected to serve the people of Newcastle in 2010, I worked in technology for over 20 years, mainly in the private sector, but my last job was in the public sector as head of technology at Ofcom, who's the regulator. And as such, I kept a copy of the 2003 Communications Act by my desk. And it's this thick, and it was on my desk. It was the source essential to the job. It was consulted regularly, for example, when trying to determine whether consumer or competition interests should be prioritized in regulation, and regulation of broadband particularly. And over the 6 years that I worked for Ofcom, the Act remained relevant, driving our regulatory approach from everything from telephone numbering, which I led on for a while, one of my claims to fame, to audiovisual content. And the Act was the product of over 2.5 years of debate, discussion and engagement, led brilliantly, I would say, by the Labour peer Lord Putnam, As part of that, he decided that the theme of the next 10 years, remember we're talking about 2003 here, would be the convergence of platforms, industries and services, including audiovisual. And so the Act then set out principles-based, forward-looking regulatory framework to harness the forces of these new technologies in the interests of citizens and consumers, creating Ofcom, a converged regulator that had the right powers to operate in a converged world. And I'd say that from 2003 to 2013, we led the world in communications regulation, and we moved from monopoly rationed broadband to real infrastructure competition, low prices and some of the highest broadband speeds in Europe. How things change. When the Communications Act was under development in 2003, so was Facebook across the Atlantic at Harvard. And then over on the West Coast, Google was yet to float, and commentators all over the world, and I remember that, wondered whether the internet would ever generate any legitimate revenues. By that they meant other than porn and gambling. 10 years later, in 2013, the digital revolution was in full throttle. Google and Facebook were becoming the largest companies on the planet, attacked for not paying taxes on revenues equivalent to the GDP of some countries. If your business wasn't on the internet, it didn't have a future, and governments all over the world were clamoring to show that they were digital. So it was clear that what we needed then was another comprehensive review, which would have been followed by legislation setting out a positive vision of a Great Britain with a principles-based regulatory framework driving technological change in the interests of citizens and consumers. And a review kicking off in 2013 could have had legislation ready in 2015 with a framework which would have been a credible foundation for public trust in technological change. So I call the 2013 Communications Review the most important review that never happened. Because it didn't happen, technology, and as a consequence, directly of that, technology has lost trust. And as an engineer, I have found it deeply disturbing to follow the trajectory of tech from, believe me, I lived this for 20 years, I remember it well. What you're doing is boring, but incredibly useful, people would say to me. Now, tech is exciting, but incredibly exploitative. Tech is the new finance, and I don't mean that in a good way. Here in the UK, Cambridge Analytica and Facebook exemplify the excesses of big tech, but across the world, politicians and regulators are slowly waking up to the challenges of tech. Tech power, algorithmic rule, market consolidation and regulatory incapacity. So the European Commission's 2.4 billion fine of Google, which I call the right fine for the wrong reason, signalled a determination to hold the tech giants accountable. Workers, in particular supported by their trade unions, are fighting back from the GMB's victory in the court, securing some employment rights for Uber employees, Addison Lee and Hermes, to the Deliveroo strike. Gig economy workers are beginning to assert their rights. Well, they're asserting their rights, that's beginning to be recognised. And Transport for London's insistence that Uber need to improve their safety practices, recognising that it's a taxi firm calling itself a tech company. So increasingly, these so-called tech companies will be regulated as real-world companies as their real-world impact becomes clearer. But such regulation is generally old-world, ad hoc, and incoherent. So what can we do about it? And I'm hoping that I'm talking to the people who are going to be very, very influential in this field and part of a wave of change. So I think first we need to understand what it is in kind of relatively simple terms. And as we live and breathe, we are excreting, I use that term advisedly, data trails that giant web crawlers digest into opportunities to monitor, control, govern or profit from us in ways that neither we nor our governments fully understand. Data effectively drives the business models of digital connectivity today, just as ARPU drove the business models in the old dispensation. And that brings me to what I call the 3 challenges, which I think map quite well onto the challenges that you've identified. The first is who controls your data and why it isn't you. We have the GDPR, which is enshrined in UK law through the Data Protection Act, but it is 7 years out of date, barely takes account of artificial intelligence and algorithmic management, and completely ignores the Internet of Things, which will increase our data trails exponentially. And this matters because the IoT, Internet of Things, has the potential to change our lives, I believe, more fundamentally than any innovation since electricity. It will be as pervasive as electricity in every home and handbag, and the applications it supports will be transformative. But who will own and control the data which is gleaned by all these devices? As companies bring more and more IoT devices to market, citizens need to be empowered to control their own data and have the digital skills and the digital infrastructure to put that control into action. The second challenge is about what is done with that data once it's captured, the growing use of algorithms to determine services that we all rely on, and in some cases, when they are government or public sector services we have no choice as to whether or not we take. So there's a facial recognition example already mentioned. In addition, Uber has admitted it knows that you are more likely to pay more for a ride when your phone battery is low, and it knows when your phone battery is low. And I was told that a major dating site optimizes its algorithm for short-term relationships, more repeat business. Now, companies argue that this is just a mirror of society, not their responsibility. They say the outcomes of algorithms are already regulated. The companies which meet them do have to meet employment law, competition law, non-discrimination law. But a mirror is not the right metaphor. By automating decision-making, algorithms industrialize bias. They are only as good as the training data and the imagination of their designers. And given their designers are likely to come from a very narrow demographic, few are women, ethnic minorities, or working class, that imagination is very narrow. And this is the issue that AOC is popularizing. And companies and governments will be judged. We need to hold them accountable for the consequences of the algorithms and machine learning that drive company profits. And this means opening up algorithms so that regulators can access them. It's one of the solutions proposed, or maybe just ensuring unlimited financial reliability for any bias. And then the third and final challenge is digital labor relations. So over the past few years, we've seen the rise of businesses which I call the new intermediaries, because I think the gig economy sounds like you're all having fun. These are companies that operate as online platforms. They own very few physical assets, and they claim, a claim which has been increasingly disputed, to have very few employees. But if you're an Uber driver, you don't get sick pay or training, but you have to own and maintain your own car, pay for your own petrol, and be on call. And your working life is, as the courts have found, determined by your employer. Now, so self-employment used to mean freedom from a boss. Now it means your boss is an algorithm. And with nearly 500,000 workers estimated by Citizens Advice to be in bogus self-employment, the government commissioned a Taylor review intended to deliver a fairer labour market, but in the end it proposed almost nothing, and what little it did propose has yet to be implemented. So given these challenges, how is tech doing? So a couple of months ago I was in Lisbon for Web Summit. And the scale was scary. It's the biggest tech gathering in the world, 70,000 people across 3 days, 7 stages, 4 halls, in a 20,000-seater arena. So the city of Lisbon paid 110 million euros to keep the Web Summit there. in the face of tough competition from others, including the UK. So it seems clear that one business model that isn't being disrupted by tech is web summits. And so in comparison to CES, which I also visited last year, Web Summit was less glitzy, more diverse, and more of the real world. But at least one very important voice was missing, and that absence highlighted how far tech still needs to go. The voice of ordinary people was nowhere to be heard. I mean, Tony Blair was there, but I wouldn't say he's the people's politician right now, if he ever was. And whilst there were a few elected politicians such as myself and the mayor of Vancouver, the third sector was absent. No consumer rights groups, no citizens groups. This, in the absence of the voice of ordinary people, Web Summit was basically still tech talking to tech. And this has got to change, because tech is everywhere and in everything. And the UN rapporteur, Peter Alson, came to my constituency, among others, to the largest food bank in the country, in Newcastle, and saw for himself that my constituents are forced to use food banks because they're being sanctioned, and they're being sanctioned because they don't do their 35 hours mandatory online job search, for which the government does not give them access to the skills or the infrastructure, and is closing the libraries, which can provide some of that. They need to do so. Levels of digital literacy and access to infrastructure are still lamentably low. So technology needs to put ordinary people at the heart. Technology for people, not people for technology. That means putting people in control of their own data, whether it's generated, particularly when whether it's generated by the private sector or the public sector. And I think that the experience of care.data is one from which the NHS hasn't learned, because it is still requiring, or looking to require, put in place only opt-out for digital health records, as opposed to opt-in, as actually promoted by the Great North Health record, also based in Newcastle, coincidentally. I think people need to be in control of their own data, algorithms accountability, and algorithms have to be accountable, and equality has to be built into the design process. Because if applications are not diverse by design, they will be unequal by outcome. And tech companies are still not succeeding in getting women and minorities through the door, and too often the same is true in the public sector. So too often still, tech evangelists denigrate or reject the importance of appropriate regulation, saying either that government has no right to regulate, or government is too dumb to regulate, or that it's all fine, and if it's not, blockchain will fix it. But unless there is an open, honest conversation and debate about the right regulation, then the wrong regulation will be imposed in a knee-jerk response to negative tabloid headlines. And that conversation can't happen without the citizen-consumer voice. And actually, I said I wouldn't mention Brexit, but I said the government is drowning in Brexit and its own internal power struggles. It hasn't got the intellectual capacity right now to facilitate the conversation as it should be. Under Labour, in Labour, our shadow digital minister, Liam Byrne, is we are putting forward a digital bill of rights, and we're right now, talking about what it should look like. Jeremy Corbyn has argued that technology should be empowering workers, enabling us to cooperate. And so I'm not saying enough probably about the opportunities here, but the ability for cooperation, the ability for shared platforms and new forms of cooperatives, on a scale not possible before. And through our industrial strategy, which I'm leading on, we'll invest in people, in places, institutions, and infrastructures. So we'll replace the precarious jobs of the Uberized economy with high skill, high wage, high productivity ones. We have a national transformation fund of 20 billion to invest in infrastructure, a national investment bank also with 20 billion to invest in regional economies. That so it is a Labour government. Right now, the current government is not putting forward any policies in this regard. And I often say that the opposite of regulation is not no regulation, it is bad regulation, which will further undermine people's confidence and trust in technology, and that will have hugely detrimental impact both on our economy but also on the opportunities to deliver public sector services in a way which is tailored and empowering for citizens. So we need the public and private and third sectors to work together to build an effective regulatory framework and make the new economy and the new government one which is of the people, by the people, for the people. And whether in private sector or in the public sector, tech needs to be on the front foot and engage with the many, or or you will find yourself on the side of the very, very few, and soon, because Justice Digital is coming. Thank you very much.